This episode of Food Psych is brought to you by my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals. If you're ready to leave diet culture behind and reclaim the life it stole from you, learn more and sign up for the course at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. Welcome to Food Psych, a podcast about intuitive eating, health at every size, body liberation, and taking down diet culture. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and I'm an anti-diet registered dietitian and certified intuitive eating counselor, offering online courses and programs to help people all over the world make peace with food. Join me here every week as I talk with interesting people from all walks of life about their relationships with food and their bodies.
I remember I was teething, little gums bleeding, cried every evening, it was all about eating. When I became a teen, it was all about beefing. Now I'm ready for the world. Try and sink my teeth in.
Hey there, welcome to episode 170 of Food Psych. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and today I'm talking with Cat Pausé, a fat studies scholar and host of the long-running fat positive radio show, Friend of Marilyn. We talked about why you can't fight quote-unquote obesity and fat stigma at the same time, the effect of stigma on health, how fat studies differs from conventional academic paradigms, the implications of using the word fat, and so much more. I can't wait to share our conversation with you in just a moment. I've been wanting to talk to Cat for a super long time, but first I'll answer this week's listener question, which is from a listener named Alexis, who uses the name of an elimination diet that I'm just going to X out here to avoid giving anyone any ideas of a diet that I don't recommend. Okay, so here's Alexis's question. I'm a registered dietitian at a university, and I've been getting more students with irritable bowel syndrome coming into my office. I go back and forth with how beneficial the X diet is with students, because sometimes I feel as if this can increase food fear and anxiety in some students. I was wondering how you would implement an X trial diet for those students while trying to incorporate intuitive eating during the process, and also after we start to add in more food groups, or any suggestions you may have. So thanks, Alexis, for that great question. And before I answer, just my usual disclaimer that these answers and this podcast in general are for informational and educational purposes only and aren't a substitute for individual medical or mental health advice. Yeah, so such a great question. And what you're talking about is really a kind of elimination diet. And to me, that and any other elimination diet are really a last resort. And even then, I wouldn't use them in someone with active disordered eating or an early recovery. I would only use them with someone, people who don't have disordered eating whatsoever, who have a really peaceful relationship with food and or are in really long-term remission from disordered eating, because the research actually shows that up to 98% of people with eating disorders have gastrointestinal issues like IBS, and a huge percentage of IBS, or irritable bowel syndrome, that's the abbreviation, IBS clients also have disordered eating, as well as other psychiatric issues like anxiety and depression, whereas the actual incidence of food allergies and intolerances is in the single digits. And actually, gastroenterology patients with IBS or other things like inflammatory bowel disease or celiac disease are also at higher risk of disordered eating than the general population. And the prevalence there is up to 44%, according to a review from 2015. And that's likely both because the disordered eating can cause or exacerbate underlying problems, right? Like, in that 98% of people with eating disorders who have gastrointestinal issues, the eating disorder largely preceded the gastrointestinal issues. So in most cases, the disordered eating is what's causing the gastrointestinal problems. But there's also the fact that people with GI disorders have to eat in somewhat restrictive ways, or often are prescribed somewhat restrictive diets in order to treat their conditions, and that can lead to disordered eating in and of itself. So for more on that science, you can check out the papers, Psychological Features Are Important Predictors of Functional Gastrointestinal Disorders in Patients with Eating Disorders. That is a mouthful. And another paper called Disordered Eating Practices in Gastrointestinal Disorders. And we'll put links to those papers in the show notes for this episode too. But just a trigger warning for these and all scientific papers, really, because they pretty much all use numbers and some stigmatizing language. So putting those there for the health professionals, but, be careful if you decide to read them. So research on IBS patients has also found that people's beliefs about which foods are quote unquote causing problems aren't actually borne out in double-blind challenges and are likely just due to a nocebo effect, what's called the nocebo effect, which is that their beliefs that the food is going to cause harm actually causes harm. The placebo effect is your belief that something's going to help you actually leads it to help you, even if you're just taking a sugar pill or whatever, something that is inert and doesn't have any real effects. And the nocebo effect is the opposite of that. It's the belief that something is going to cause harm actually causes harm, even if the thing you're doing isn't actually causing harm in the first place. It's just the belief that's causing harm. So I'm writing about that in my book right now. So I'll have a lot more to share about that in 2019. And I also talked about it with Alan Levinovitz in episode 94 of the podcast, if you want to check that out. But suffice it to say that even researchers who study IBS have told me that people are so inundated these days with advice about what foods to cut out that they often experience nocebo effects when eating those foods. And that happens a lot with gluten, but it's happening increasingly with other kinds of foods, including the types of foods you're supposed to eliminate on this X diet that you mentioned, the person who asked the question. So with the fact that there are such high prevalence rates of IBS in people with eating disorders and that disordered eating can cause or exacerbate intestinal issues, Occam's razor really says that it's more likely IBS has a psychological or behavioral cause than it does a food-based cause, because again, the rates of actual food intolerance or food sensitivity are in the single digits. So I would really steer clear of recommending dietary restrictions to your patients, and instead I would look at whether they're approaching food in a disordered way, which includes things like quote-unquote clean eating and self-initiated elimination diets and all these other fads that go under the guise of quote-unquote wellness in this day and age, but are really just sneaky new forms of diet culture, or what I call the wellness diet, which is diet culture's 21st century manifestation. And I've seen so many people on the wellness diet who, for example, were eating so much fiber because they were trying to only eat so-called whole foods and a quote-unquote plant-based diet. And that way of eating was actually causing them to eat so much fiber that they were getting gas and bloating and abdominal pain and diarrhea that went away as soon as they cut back on those high-fiber foods and brought back some more refined grains and fun foods and stopped trying to be so quote-unquote clean with their diet. So that would definitely be something to look into with these clients, because college students are really at huge risk for the wellness diet and the disordered behaviors that it creates, because young people in general, I think, are very susceptible to this stuff through social media, and that's where it often gets perpetuated. And it's really important to look into what fads and beliefs are these clients buying into that could be causing and exacerbating their IBS. And I would also explore with them whether they even just have a ton of anxiety about food, regardless of whether or not that's manifesting in actual food avoidance or other disordered symptoms, because the anxiety alone can actually drive the IBS. And so I would really work on that, work on helping them reject the diet mentality, reject the wellness diet, uncover any disordered behaviors that they may have with food. And certain disordered behaviors people often don't want to tell you about right away, like bulimic behaviors, especially. People tend to be pretty cautious about opening up about that stuff. So you have to build some trust with the clients and have multiple sessions often before they'll even reveal that they're doing that. So I think it's worth just really making it sort of a long-term relationship with these clients if you can. Hopefully the university covers that and allows for that, because that's an age group where the prevalence rates of disordered eating are really high. And so if and only if you're able to work through those things with them and they're still having symptoms, like after you've worked through disordered eating over time, or if they're not at all disordered about food and you've determined that by screening them and talking with them over a series of sessions, then maybe you can try helping them mindfully identify if any foods are causing them trouble, like a gentle nutrition component of intuitive eating, but not a full-on elimination diet, more a one-at-a-time thing, because I think a full-on elimination diet is pretty risky for disordered eating, even if someone doesn't have pre-existing disordered eating. And again, I wouldn't do this with anyone who had any form of disordered relationship with food currently, or any history of disordered eating that wasn't firmly in the past and in remission now, because eliminating foods can really trigger that disordered mindset, even if it's just a one-at-a-time thing as opposed to a full-on elimination diet. Because remember, the study that I just mentioned showing that people with GI disorders are at higher risk of disordered eating, in part because of the restrictive diets that they have to go on for disease management, right? So you don't want to trigger that in your patients. I think it's really important to keep that in mind, that these things, as Alan Levinovitz and I actually talked about in episode 94, restrictive diets are not without side effects. And sometimes they can be iatrogenic. They can actually cause disorders that were not there before. And so people think of quote unquote natural remedies like changing your food or eliminating certain foods as not having side effects the way medications do, but that is just bunk. They absolutely do have side effects, and sometimes those side effects can be far worse than anything caused by a medication because it can actually cause you to spiral into disordered eating. So I would really proceed carefully, and I think you're right. I think your intuition is telling you to proceed carefully. So I would listen to that because it sounds like you are feeling a little conflicted about prescribing this diet to anyone in your population. So one other thing that I want to highlight and just something to keep in mind here is that even though there is some scientific evidence supporting the X diet, that particular diet that you mentioned for IBS, it actually doesn't have the greatest adherence rate. And it's really only meant for short-term use, like very short-term use, in order to identify foods that might be causing issues for a given patient. Like I said, I don't ever put people on it because of the risk of disordered eating and because the client population that I work with comes to me for disordered eating. That's kind of what I'm known for. So if someone's coming to see me, there's a good bet that they've got something going on in their relationship with food, and I don't want to be messing with that. So I don't put anyone on that kind of diet or any elimination diet, but I have had clients come to me who had already been put on it by their gastroenterologist or by other dietitians. And I know clinically, I haven't actually seen anyone have significant improvements in symptoms on that diet. And whenever I've brought up this issue with colleagues, they've also told me that they've observed the same thing in their practice. So this diet isn't necessarily going to be helpful, even for that small percentage of people you might see who don't have some sort of disorder relationship with food that might be causing or exacerbating their IBS. So I hope that helps. I hope that gives you a little bit of a place to start with some of these clients, and I'm wishing you luck in your work with them. If you want to submit your own question for a chance to have it answered on an upcoming episode, go to christyharrison.com/questions. That's christyharrison.com/questions. And then if you want a whole library of answers from me to help you master intuitive eating, questions and answers that aren't available anywhere else, plus the chance to ask me any question you want and have me answer it for you, you can join my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals. The course has 13 modules of content teaching you the principles of intuitive eating in depth, plus an exclusive monthly Q&A podcast with answers to hundreds of participants' questions already. And when you join the course, you can ask me your questions and have me answer them in the following month's course Q&A. Which is something that participants really love and have told me that they get a lot out of the Q&As because they help make things clear and they make it really a personal touch as part of the course so that it feels much more like a private coaching or group coaching program as opposed to just an online course. And another thing participants really love is our private Facebook group, which is exclusively for members because it's full of such amazing people and just people who are really supportive of each other on their journey to intuitive eating. And I'm in there as well, along with my staff, providing guidance. And so you really get a huge amount of community support and individual attention in this course. If you're ready to become an intuitive eater and leave diet culture behind once and for all, you can learn more and sign up for the course at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. We're brought to you today by LinkedIn. The right hire can make a huge impact on your business or practice, which is why it's so important to find the right fit. But where do you find them? Instead of posting on job boards, find the person who will help you grow your business with LinkedIn. As the world's largest professional network, people go to LinkedIn every day to grow professionally and discover job opportunities, and 70% of the US workforce is already there. LinkedIn Jobs matches people to your role based on who they really are, their skills, their interests, and even how open they are to new opportunities. That way, your job gets seen by more of the right people. Most LinkedIn members haven't recently visited one of the top job boards, but 9 out of 10 members are open to new opportunities, so you can only reach them on LinkedIn. That's why a new hire is made every 10 seconds using LinkedIn. Head over to linkedin.com/foodpsych and get $50 off your first job post. That's linkedin.com/FOODPSYCH to get $50 off your first job post. linkedin.com/foodpsych. Terms and conditions apply. We're also brought to you today by Paribus. Stop deleting your emails. Mass deleting your junk mail could actually be costing you money. Intrigued? Our secret weapon here at Food Psych HQ is Paribus, a tool that gets you money back. It's 100% free to sign up, and customers keep 100% of the savings. There are no hidden fees or costs. Once you sign up, Paribus will scan your emails for receipts, finding refunds that you're owed from online stores and making it easy for you to save money. If it discovers you've bought something online from one of the retailers it monitors, it will track the item's price and help you get a refund when the price drops. Paribus monitors online stores like Target, Gap, Old Navy, Nordstrom, Best Buy, and many more. Sound too good to be true? Well, there's more. If your guaranteed shipment from select online retailers shows up late, even that 2-day shipment, Paribus will help you get compensated. Head over to getparibus.com to sign up. That's GETPARIBUS.com and sign up now. Finally, we're brought to you today by Tomboy X. I am so psyched to have them as a sponsor because size and gender inclusiveness are central to their whole brand, and I love to support brands who really get it like they do. Tomboy X is revolutionizing the underwear game by making underwear to fit you and how you see yourself. They have everything from bikinis, briefs, boxer briefs, trunks, and boy shorts to soft bras and racerback bras, which are hands down the most comfortable bras I've ever worn. They come in everyday basic colors and fun seasonal prints like wildflowers and skulls and octopus and polka dots that are actually little cats. So cute. And regardless of where you fall on the size or gender spectrum, Tomboy X offers amazing underwear that any body can feel comfortable in. Now you can support the podcast and support their amazing mission at the same time. Just go to tomboyx.com/foodpsych and check out their special bundles and pack pricing. FoodPsych listeners will get an extra 15% off with the code FoodPsych. Again, just use the code FoodPsych, that's FOODPSYCH, for an extra 15% off. Ditch whatever you're wearing for a pair of Tomboy X underwear. Go to tomboyx.com/foodpsych. And now, without any further ado, let's go to my conversation with Cat Pausé. So tell me about your relationship with food growing up.
My relationship with food was incredibly confused, overshadowed by a lot of food policing by my father, and engaged with a lot of subterfuge and hiding. Um, um, so my dad was very much into food policing the entire family. And I learned really early on to associate my own hunger and my desire for food as something that was shameful and something that I should feel quite guilty about. And then at some point in my probably late, early, maybe middle childhood, I discovered that my mother hid candy in her closet. My parents had two independent walk-in closets, kind of his and hers. And I'm not entirely sure how I discovered it, but I discovered that my mother was hiding. I think they were turtles, like those caramel nut chocolate covered in chocolate things.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a defining moment for me because that taught me that, I also can hide my food and my consumption from my father and get away with the things I'd like to be doing. And and in addition to that, I was a fat kid. Like I've always been fat. And so there were a lot of other things around food in terms of just how my family treated it in general, how I was taught really early on about like restrictions and going on the same diets that my mother would go on and those types of things. So I would definitely say that I had a pretty toxic and confused relationship with food growing up for sure.
Yeah, and it sounds like it started pretty early too.
Yeah, earliest memories that I can remember about food are all pretty much cloaked in shame and whatnot.
That's so sad because kids are born with such an intuitive connection with food, and like without any interference or fat phobia intervening, they can kind of hold on to that to some extent, until they get indoctrinated into diet culture, but often that's later. But it sounds like it started so young for you that you don't really have memories of like a positive, intuitive relationship with food, really.
No, I really don't.
And what was your relationship with your body like at that point?
The body relationship was pretty positive, and has been really for most of my life. Even in the, moments, whether they would be kind of small kind of lapses or longer periods of questioning, like during adolescence when body shaming is often kind of very salient due to puberty and adolescent egocentrism and other things such as that. Even during those times when I knew that I was supposed to feel incredibly bad about my body and want desperately to have a different kind of body, I always had a a voice in the back of my mind that was like, "Oh, I think we're okay here. I don't think there's anything wrong with us." And luckily, I was quite a precocious child. I was very smart. I was very outgoing. I had a really lovely singing voice. And so I did get quite a lot of and I was an only child. So I got a lot of positive feedback from the adults that mainly kind of populated my life for most of my youth around a lot of other things about me. So I think that that probably helped kind of offset any negative feelings that might have also being sent my way about the fact that I had a fat body and, fat bodies. Like I knew that having a fat body wasn't what I was supposed to have, but I always remember being very fond of my body, regardless of what other people wanted me to think about it.
That's amazing. That's a real gift. And it sounds like maybe that sort of sense of self-esteem really came from other areas of your life being valued and feeling like you had value in those places.
Yeah, and I think part of it too, my favorite aunt was incredibly fat and my mom was fat and quite a few other members of her family were fat. And I mean, they were, especially my mom, like they were very openly interested in performing kind of good fatty behaviors. So they were always dieting and talking about their diets and those types of things. But my favorite aunt wasn't like that. And while I know now, now that I have a different relationship with her as I, grew and became an adult as well, kind of thing, she never seemed like bothered or upset by her size. And I think that really probably helped me kind of wasn't intending to be a fat positive role model for me, but she absolutely was. I also took quite a lot of, I don't know what the right word is, but the fat fairy in Disney's animated Cinderella or Sleeping Beauty.
Yeah.
The fat blue fairy, like I loved her. She was one of my favorite movie characters when I was a little kid. And so yeah, I think I had quite a few fat positive role models that weren't intending to be that when I was growing up, that I think probably really helped with the way that I understood my own fatness and my own body.
Yeah, it sounds like it. That's amazing. That's also such a gift to have someone in your life that modeled not being in a self-loathing relationship with their body, just living their life and being fat.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if, that was something with my aunt that she did consciously or if it just, if she really just wasn't kind of bothered by it. She didn't, we lived in a different place, so I didn't necessarily see her very often. But yeah, she definitely was the one I idolized because she was also a singer and she was a very assertive, strong, independent woman. And it was like, yeah, that's what I wanted to be. So I kept that with me even when, I'd be telling my mother as a young child, Mama, you're so beautiful. And her response back to me was always, oh, sweetie, I'm not beautiful, I'm fat. So I, learned really early on that being fat meant you couldn't be beautiful. But I guess it was one of those things that I decided wasn't a trade-off I was too bothered by.
Right. Right. So being beautiful or meeting the societal standards of beauty didn't seem to be a value you held too highly.
Yeah, and I think it possibly could be that that was probably one of the first lessons I really did kind of learn and internalize about societal standards and bodies and stuff. And I think I probably learned it young enough that it was just kind of like, this just isn't an option for you because you're fat. And so it just never bothered me, in the same way that, you might learn really early on that being an astronaut isn't an option for you because you're like claustrophobic or that this particular thing isn't an option for you because you don't like heights or something. I think I might have just kind of learned it early enough that I was like, oh, right, okay, so I can't be beautiful because I'm fat, but that's not a problem because there's all these other things I can be. And
right, you had other avenues available to you. So it wasn't just beauty wasn't the only way to be seen in the world or to have value in the world.
No, definitely not. My parents, whether they intended it or not, they very much raised me, especially with like the media that I consumed. I wasn't allowed to watch TV. I was only allowed to watch specific movies that they kind of deemed appropriate. And like I look back on them now, and most of them had incredibly strong female characters. And so I like to give my parents a hard time that they can't be surprised that I became a feminist when, this was the media that they were letting me consume.
Right.
What did they expect was going to happen?
Oh, that's amazing. That is so true. I think about that a lot because I had some friends growing up who weren't allowed to watch TV. And, I was always like, oh, how weird. And they would sort of be annoyed that they didn't have access to pop culture. But then, you think about it now, and it's like, what sort of toxic messaging do you miss out on when you don't have access to TV, and how much does that save you from actually? Versus, yeah, I can connect with people about what was on Nickelodeon in the 1980s and 90s, but that actually doesn't really serve me, I don't think that helped my self-esteem or development as a human being all that much. So
I definitely hated it when I was little, and I took such joy when I was at a friend's house. So all I wanted to do then was watch TV, because it was the thing I wasn't allowed to do.
Right.
And I wasn't allowed to have Barbies and a lot of those kinds of restrictions and parameters around. But that was really just kind of my childhood, because by the time I had adolescence and I was often home alone and other things like that, then all restrictions were off and I was able to consume what I wanted. But yeah, in some of those earlier formative years, there were very specific things I was allowed, and most of them had, very strong female characters in them. So that's kind of what I grew up watching and thinking about. This is what it means these are the different ways to be.
Right. Did your parents have feminist values at all? Was that conscious on their part?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it would be easy to say no, because if you call my mom, for my mom, feminism was one of the F words. Horrified, if I were to suggest to her that she was a feminist. So no, not kind of in that way. But my mom is Catholic, and she's a very serious, devout Catholic. She goes to mass twice a day. And within that Catholicism for her, she has a really strong kind of social justice bent, taking care of the poor and those who need help from their community and stuff. So she definitely raised me with those kinds of values. My dad's pretty conservative as well, and he joined the Catholic Church when I was an adult. Yeah, so I mean, no, not really. Trying to think about, because neither of them really have kind of liberal values or progressive values at all. I'm very much the bleeding heart feminist liberal daughter of two incredibly conservative pro-life parents. But yeah, I don't. So
That's really interesting, though. It sounds like it was sort of an inadvertent feminist streak that they had, or just maybe a side effect of wanting to have you have wholesome things that you consumed or something like that, and that things that happened to be disparaging to women were also sort of not wholesome in this way that maybe they wanted you to be.
Yeah, maybe.
But how did things change when you hit adolescence then, and you started to have a little more agency and ability to go out on your own? How did it change your relationship with food and also your body and sort of the culture you consumed?
Well, I think that for me, probably a lot of people in the global north, as I got closer to adolescence, I had a lot more freedom in terms of, I think by the time I was 11 or 12, I was letting myself into the house after school because both my parents were still at work, kind of situation. And so I had a lot of autonomy in terms of what I could watch, what I could eat. Of course, that was tempered by the fact that, if there was a box of something in the cabinet and it was, full when I got home and empty by the time my parents came home, that's the kind of thing my dad would definitely notice and I'd get in trouble for. But I think especially once I started working, so I actually had my first shift of my first job on my 16th birthday because I was so excited to start working. And I had, pocket money for myself meant that, I could start I had a lot more freedom about what I ate in terms of being able to spend my own money on the things that I wanted. Yeah. So, I mean, it's funny with food, and this will probably be something actually that I'm about to say that you will slice earlier. Um, One of the things is that my parents were both from California, but we moved to Texas before I was born because of my dad's job. And so the food culture of Texas was very different from the food culture within my own household. And what that meant was that kind of growing up, my friends didn't want to come to my house for dinner because my mom was serving like fish and chicken and vegetables, and what they had every night was like meat and mashed potatoes and gravy and rolls. So I was always very eager to go to my friends' houses because I liked starches like that, mashed potatoes and gravy and dinner rolls and stuff. I thought was a really great way to eat, but no one ever wanted to come to my house, so that was one of the things that I would have identified really early on about food and culture and the kinds of food that my parents ate. But I'll also never forget, in fact, the aunt that I mentioned earlier that was a role model to me. I was probably 8 or 9 the first time she ever asked for extra sour cream in a restaurant. And that moment kind of changed my life. Because I'm sure at that point there had been times when I had wanted like more sour cream than was normally given, like with fajitas. So I grew up in Texas, so Mexican food and fajitas and stuff were things that we ate out quite often for. And I probably would have actually at one point had asked my parents, like, I don't have enough sour cream, or, signal to them that that was happening. And I don't know if it would have just been a question of them shutting it down with saying, you've got plenty, or you don't need more, or whatever. But I never knew that you could actually ask for more until sitting in this restaurant with my aunt when I was 8, and she actually asked for more sour cream. And the server didn't blink an eye and immediately brought her a second ramekin of sour cream that she then, used some of in order to have the amount that she wanted. And that really changed the way that I approached food and my own needs, especially in settings like that moving forward, because I never knew you could ask for more sour cream and that it would be a big deal, or, that they wouldn't make fun of you or even charge you more, or it just, it really opened my eyes to like, oh, I can order extra sour cream. Like, all right, then good to know.
Yeah, that's amazing, because it's like about kind of getting your needs met too, and getting the thing that you desire, the thing that brings you pleasure.
Yeah. Well, and also too, if I want more sour cream on, rather than like being very cautious about how much I'm going to put on each of the 2 tortillas, knowing I can get more means I can put as much as I think I want.
Right.
On each fajita, and, not have to worry about rationing.
Right. Yeah. So each fajita gets to be tastier because you can have more.
That's right. It can be exactly what you want it to be. That's right.
Oh, that's such a nice model to have of someone who just did what they wanted with food and didn't make any, apologies for it.
Yeah, changed my life, truly. Not just about food, too. Like, I think, that was a really important lesson to me about just if you ask for something, more than likely you'll be able to get it, so just having your needs met in general, which is so important for women.
Yes.
Because far out, women are so socialized to not say what we need or feel like our needs should be met, or, demand that they be met, or any of those types of things. So yeah, that moment.
Oh, that's amazing. I'm just thinking too about like some guests that I've had and clients that I've had who've been from the South, and how, in Texas specifically in some cases, and how there's like this culture of self-effacement with women and diet, like rampant diet culture, in certain kind of, I guess, social strata in the South. And I wonder if that was present for you at all, like if you experienced that with your peers or other people around you growing up, or if that really didn't touch you in sort of the stratum that you were.
I mean, to be honest, I just remember that always being part of conversations whenever there would be multiple women together, regardless of their age, regardless of their class, regardless of where we were, regardless if they even knew each other. I mean, it's often struck me how if you put a group of women into a room that actually don't know each other at all, one of the first things that they often choose to kind of bond over is, their own kind of stories or techniques or strategies, or one-upping each other around issues around diet and food and those types of things. So I mean, I I was born and raised in Texas, so I can't speak of if that's something that's kind of endemic across the states. I can say that moving to New Zealand, I found a lot less of that here. And I don't know if that's a cultural thing or if that's partly just I'm now an adult in a proper adult job. Like it could just be a different question of I'm an academic. And so that isn't as endemic within academia, at least not, kind of in the open halls or openly where people might hear you. Although there have been women, especially that I've met here that I've quite liked and thought, oh, I'd like to develop a friendship with them. And then the second time we're hanging out, all they're doing is talking about their points with Weight Watchers. And so I've, not then continued on a friendship, or at least not a close friendship, because I choose not to have that kind of stuff in my own world. But yeah, it was definitely a huge part of life as I remember it in Texas. And even now when I go home for Christmas, of course, I'm home around the holidays, and that's when people tend to obsess about those types of things more than normal, at least in my experience. And luckily, for the most part, I mean, I've had some really awkward and some really hard conversations with most of the people that I really do care about, around those kinds of conversations and how I won't be privy to them.
That's a tough boundary to set, but such a necessary one, I think, in a lot of cases, because it's so triggering and so frustrating to have to hear that kind of discourse.
Yeah, especially in the home. The hardest conversations with that were with my dad and around his food policing. And it was a conversation that we kept kind of having to have kind of over and over. And me just trying to get him to understand that I don't feel safe in his home if I don't know, or if I'm not sure whether or not he's going to pull any of that while I'm home. And especially now that I'm home for only once a year since I live across the world. But when I am home, I'm home for like 3 weeks, and most of it is spent like physically in his presence by choice. My dad's one of my best friends, but yeah, we had to have quite a few really ugly conversations, and there was a lot of crying on both of our parts across a lot of different years to really get to a place where, yeah, we were both felt comfortable kind of operating. But even now, there are slips. It's so ingrained in him. Like, I appreciate that it's really difficult for him to not engage in that and stuff. But yeah, it's quite heartbreaking when it does happen and spins us right back into those hard, awful, ugly places and conversations.
Absolutely. When did you first start being able to talk with him about that stuff?
Not until just within the last decade. So not until I was doing this as a scholar, definitely not until I was being more active as an activist. Only recently in the last probably 6 or 7 years.
I think that's really helpful for people to hear, because I think there's this tendency to feel like you need to set all those boundaries right now or like yesterday, because it is so painful to have to deal with people's food policing and body shaming and all that stuff. And yet it does take so much building up of your own resources to get to a place where you can set those boundaries, because I have had this similar experience with my parents. Like, I grew up always in a thinner body, and my parents being in thinner bodies too, but terrified of fatness, terrified of weight gain, always making comments about food, and nothing like really that out of the ordinary in diet culture. It was sort of just how it was. And so I think it was very much ingrained in me too, that I needed to fear fatness and weight gain and fear certain foods and all of that stuff. And even though I was allowed to be an intuitive eater for my whole childhood, basically, all of that tinder of fat phobia really caught fire for me in college when I gained a little bit of weight. And then I was like, okay, now here's this big fire of all the fat phobia that I've learned. And now I have to do something with it. I have to diet, basically. I have to change my body and shrink my body. And that led down a very disordered road. And only after I recovered from the really disordered part and was still in the process of recovering from the body shame stuff was I even able to start broaching the subject with my parents. And those were some really painful conversations. And definitely also took years of kind of revisiting the same conversations and having it be so painful the first couple times that I backed way off and was like, oh, I never want to talk about this with them again, or hopefully they'll understand and I'll never have to. And of course they didn't, because it's hard to like undo the sort of habitual ways that you talk about food and bodies. And so we had to keep circling back around those conversations, but at times I wasn't ready for it and would just sort of bite my tongue or leave the room or whatever. And yeah, only in the past like 5 years, I guess, maybe 3 years, I would say, have I been able to come to a place of like really feeling secure in talking with them about food and body stuff, to where they also like know that if they're about to say something that might be questionable, they'll ask me first or be like, you're probably not going to like this, so I might not even say it, you know? And that's been such a huge breakthrough, but it has also taken years to get to that point.
Yeah, and I think for me, part of how I managed to kind of get to that point was being willing to withhold my presence otherwise, which was a really hard thing in the sense of I am an only child. I'm incredibly close to both my parents. I talk to them almost every day. So the idea that I wouldn't be willing to come home unless it could be a safe place for me was something that, you know, I really kind of had to work up to myself, you know, but also I guess probably made it incredibly more salient for him, you know, to hear. And of course, I mean, my father's a lovely person. So, you know, for me to simply explain it in a way to say, like, I don't feel safe here because you do this, it was horrifying for him. I mean, he immediately started crying the first time I phrased it that way, because the idea that his kid wouldn't feel safe around him is just, I'm lucky because he's an incredible man and a very loving father. But yeah, those are hard conversations to have with the people that really matter, because there's so much on the line. And in a way, you're potentially straining, you know, like those conversations could have gone a different way. And it could be that, you know, my dad and I are still family, but we're not close like we used to be. You know, like luckily we did get back, you know, we were able to maintain that or get back there. But there's a lot of risk involved, you know, but at the same time, the toxicity of having to live in that, you know, if that is something that's difficult for you, like it was for me, it just, you know, it finally kind of overwhelmed it and was like, nope, we're not doing this anymore.
Right.
And also, too, to be honest, Christy, I'm a bit of a brat. It's very possible that one of the first earlier times I would have brought it up with him, it was really more in a bratty way of, you know, being like, do you realize what a dick you're being when you do this? And actually, I do remember that when I first started doing it, I was actually doing it more on my mother's behalf than mine. It's always easier, I think, to stand up for someone else than it is to stand up for yourself. So I remember the first couple of times because early on in the piece when I first started bringing it up, I was doing it more like to scold him and to be like, what are you doing? Like, she's a grown woman, like, knock it off. You know, what's the matter with you? And that then eventually kind of grew into me actually being able to have a more serious conversation with him about my own feelings around that.
And it's so natural, I think, that the anger would be there for you too, right? That you had so much built up and so much resentment probably over the years of having to deal with his food policing of both you and your mom in your presence, that there was a lot of rage behind it. So it came out in this bratty way of phrasing things. It's like, of course.
And plus, like, there's all of the other pent up rage that I might have had around other things. Plus, and I don't know if this is true for other adults or if this is something that, I don't think this is me unique. I don't think I'm special in that way. I wonder how much of this is because I do live on the other side of the world. But like when I do go home, I kind of become the worst version of myself.
Yep.
And it's not so much that I resort to being like a teenage version of me, but there's something about like being home within 24 hours. Like I can feel like I'm being my worst version, where I've immediately kind of fallen back into a lot of old patterns of behavior and stuff in our parent-child relationship that I feel like I've moved past in every other kind of aspect. And even when I'm not at home with them. So yeah, I think that always contributes to it as well.
Oh yeah. I feel you on that. I definitely have the same experience, and I live like 3,000 miles from my parents. So I grew up in California and they're still there, and I'm in New York. So, it's definitely only a few times a year that I see them, but very quickly within, probably 24 to 48 hours, I feel like I'm slipping back, like I'm just receding into this younger version of myself, really, that was interacting with them in a way that was sort of unconscious. And I just, I feel like I'm so much more conscious and aware of my dynamics with people now, having been out of the house for whatever, 20 years or something now, and having gone through a lot of therapy and done a lot of work around childhood trauma and stuff like that, and having been away from my parents for long enough to where like we talk on the phone a lot, but it's like we're not there in person interacting. We're having conversations about how's your life, what's going on with you, and and it's much more, I don't know, there's something different about like being in the same house you grew up in, especially. And
yeah, right?
With the same people. Oh, yeah. That environment just really sucks you back in.
Okay, good. I'm glad I didn't think it was just me. Like, I promise I don't think I'm like unique and like the only one who's ever, but I have often wondered, I'm like, is this, because I don't remember this happening before I moved to New Zealand. I don't remember like going home for Thanksgiving and Christmas. And maybe it's actually just a time amount in the sense of because I did the last 8 years I was in the States, I was only 2 hours away at grad school. So when I did go home, it was rarely for more than a day and a half at a time. Whereas now, like I'm there for several weeks just because of the distance and stuff. But yeah, I do. I become my worst version of myself, which is like, they're so lucky, right?
Oh, totally. Oh my God. Well, so I'm curious, like this whole transition from being a kid who was being food policed and having to grapple with how other people are perceiving your body and going from there to deciding to become a scholar in fat studies. Like, what was that trajectory like for you? What helped you make that decision?
So I spent most of my life up until like my late 20s trying to lose weight, which is probably true for most fat people. Losing weight and gaining weight, losing weight and gaining weight. So I had pretty toxic relationships with both food and exercise pretty much my entire life until really recently. Going to becoming a scholar, kind of going to graduate school was actually that was never in question for me. Both my parents hold graduate degrees, so it wasn't kind of a question of if I was going to go to grad school, but what I was going to study when I went. And I picked really early, actually, when I was in high school, that I wanted to do sociology because I was lucky enough to have a sociology class when I was in high school and thought, this is amazing. So I did. I did my bachelor, my master's in soc, and then I ended up doing my Ph.D. in human development, which is kind of a mix of soc and psych in a way. And actually, I knew nothing about fat studies as a field or that such a thing existed, or even like critical obesity studies, like what Paul Campos does and Michael Gard does. I knew none of that actually until I became a full-fledged academic. So my PhD research actually looked at weight identity in super fat women, but from a completely uncritical perspective, in the sense of I was framing it with theories of identity development from human development, but without any kind of understanding that, there was this other literature around fatness and critical obesity and whatnot. And it was one of my interview participants, actually, who at the end of my interview had asked me if I had ever read The Diet Myth by Paul Campos. And I hadn't, and she thought I would like it. So I put it on my list, basically, of all the books I wanted to read when I finished my PhD. Because for anyone who studied at the graduate level, you know that there's very little time to, especially reading. Like, you might have time to like watch Netflix, to binge something on Netflix, but when it comes to what you're reading, you have so much school-related stuff you have to read that, you really don't get to read for pleasure very often. So I put it on the list of things to read, and I read it probably towards the end of my very first year in my first academic job, which was in a human development faculty in New Zealand, which is where I currently actually still am. And that book changed everything for me. For your listeners who aren't familiar, The Diet Myth by Paul Campos. So Paul Campos is a law scholar. He got interested in issues around body size during the Monica Lewinsky, Bill Clinton news cycle. because he was incredibly intrigued by how much of the attention around that wasn't so much that the president had an affair, had had an affair with an intern, but the fact that he had actually done those things with a fat intern. And so campus got really interested in that. And so he wrote an entire book that actually kind of dissects the really erroneous science that props up the idea of the obesity epidemic and the fatpocalypse and those types of things. And that was actually probably the right way for me to kind of become introduced to newer ways of thinking around fatness personally, because as a scientist, his book, it was the right introduction for me. I don't know if I had been introduced to the politics first, if that really would have captured me, because at the time, while I had been a fat person my whole life and felt pretty good about my fat body, I didn't really have a fat identity independent of that. And if someone would have been like, fat rights are human rights, I just would have been really confused and like, what? What are you talking about? But Paul's book was full of the science of around, that weight isn't a predictor of health, and that, weight loss is futile, and, all of those types of things that I had believed just because it's what we're told and it's what I had been reading. And yeah, so his book was the introduction to me. And like any good scholar, once I was kind of introduced to a more critical perspective, I just tumbled down the rabbit hole. And it was very quickly led me from the critical obesity stuff into the fat study stuff, which is a very different kind of scholarship that centers fatness and the lived experience of fat people from an unproblematic perspective. And yeah, it just became really clear to me that the things that I had been interested in around weight identity and stigma, I could very much be doing from a different theoretical and methodological framework that actually fit even better than what I'd been using previously.
How did that change then your perspective on, what the topic of your PhD thesis, identity formation in super fat women, and also where did your scholarship go from there?
Well, I mean, I look back on my thesis and with largely just contempt, which is pretty common actually from a lot of my friends that are also PhDs. Because I didn't, know another way. Like the title of my thesis is Weight Identity in Morbidly Obese Women. And the language throughout my dissertation is about obesity and morbid obesity. And, so I look back on it now and I'm like, oh, but, I appreciate that that's where I was in the, I didn't know any better. And I was still working from a slightly kind of fat friendly place, in the sense that I didn't go into the study assuming that the women I was speaking to were going to be incredibly negative about their size. And I didn't kind of write it in that way either. But not having any other literature to kind of frame it or theory to understand it, I was working through an obesity epidemic framework and lens, as most scholars who do this work do. I think I started kind of getting engaged in fat study scholarship initially more as something that interested me rather than as a field of scholarship I thought I could contribute to. I was really keen to learn as much as I could. I was actively sharing things in social media from fat study scholars. And, along the way, it became apparent to me that it would be an appropriate framework for my own work, and even a better framework for my own work around stigma and how it impacts on the health and well-being of fat people. And it also very much brought me then into the political side of it as well, around coming out as a fat person and developing a fat positive identity, and then beginning to engage in the kind of work I do now about trying to promote the rights of fat people and get people to appreciate that fat rights are human rights.
Yeah. Can you explain a little bit more about the framework of fat studies and how that differs from other types of scholarship, like critical obesity studies you mentioned, and also, of course, the dominant paradigm?
Yeah. So from my perspective, and this is just my perspective, what probably some of the earliest kind of recognized form of scholarship around fatness was what I would call obesity studies. So these are people that are studying obesity, and we're really quick to identify it, pathologize it. This is a bad thing. We need to cure this. We need to problem, fix this, solve. What came out of that then was a field that I would call critical obesity scholars who took real issue with the epistemological and ontological and methodological approaches that obesity scholars were taking. So people like Paul Campos and Michael Gard would definitely, and Paul Ernsberger would all definitely fall into, in my mind, in that camp. So their work is really about kind of highlighting the poor work, if you will, of people who are doing obesity science. Kind of alongside the critical obesity scholars are people that would identify as weight scholars. So they're often doing more kind of, they're not looking at obesity research and picking it apart from a critical perspective, but they are taking a more like conservative, compassionate approach to the study of obesity. So people like Rebecca Puel and Kelly Brownell, like that whole group of people who are researching around obesity stigma and discrimination around obesity and these types of things, they do what I would call weight studies because, they're not necessarily reproducing the same kind of problematic, this is all bad and this is why it's bad. But at the same time, they still are, they're looking around kind of prevention at the same time that they're trying to look at things like stigma. And they don't necessarily seem to recognize that they're reproducing the stigma in their work around prevention.
Yes. Ugh.
They really seem to not appreciate that they can't do both.
Right. It's maddening. It's like, what are you doing? Side note, I'm working on a book of my own about, it's like a popular literature about diet culture and looking into trying to really make the case and make the argument airtight that any sort of recommendation of weight loss or discussion around why larger bodies are less quote unquote healthy is weight stigma, like why that perpetuates weight stigma, why that constitutes weight stigma. But it's very hard to make that argument in a way that's not, that someone isn't going to be able to pick apart. Like I've been having a hard time being like, okay, well, if you're coming with the assumption that fatness is bad and that it's always unhealthy, then how am I going to convince someone who's in that framework that any sort of recommending a diet, recommending weight loss, recommending just saying that you're unhealthy if you're fat is a form of weight stigma? And it's hard to do.
Yeah, well, and part of that is because, most people don't want to recognize that. People, scholars especially, they like to think that they're not harming people with the work that they're doing. When, of course, we know that the most of the violence that's been done to marginalized communities, not most, a lot of violence that has been done to marginalized communities across history has been done through science. But yeah, so we've got this group that I would call like weight study scholars and, other people like Deborah Lepton and Angela Meadows and like people that study like anti-fat attitudes and Crandall's work. And there's so many people that kind of fall into that camp. Like, they're interested in, I would say anyone who calls it weight stigma actually would go into that camp. Like these are weight science scholars. So there are those three groups of people that in a way can kind of loosely be in one kind of umbrella, if you would, but very much, doing different things. In juxtaposition, I would suggest to those three groups are fat studies scholars. And fat studies is a discipline, it's interdisciplinary. So it's similar to like women's studies and queer studies in the sense of it's more about a framework. And so you have people from lots of different, from history, from English, from psychology, from medicine, from law, lots of different disciplines who are actually doing fat study scholarship. And for me, what the difference is that fat study scholarship does two things. One, it centers fatness first and foremost. If you're not centering fatness in your work, you're not doing fat study scholarship. And it centers fatness as unproblematic. So it starts off with fat as kind of being a neutral thing to be. Now, there's a lot of really interesting fat study scholarship that looks at how fat has been problematized and, all those kinds of interesting things, but it doesn't start at that assumption kind of point that there's something wrong with being fat. So for me, that's kind of the central hallmark of if you're not doing that, then you're not doing fat study scholarship. The second level that I would suggest about how you can tell if it's fat studies or not is if it's drawing from the fat studies literature. So, fat studies as a field in a more organized way is still relatively recent. Our first academic journal started being published in 2011. The Fat Studies Reader only came out in 2009. But, I would say you can trace fat studies stuff farther back than that, for several decades. So we've got a really well-established literature in the field. And so from my two perspectives, those are the two kinds of defining characteristics. Are you centering fatness as unproblematic? And are you drawing from the fat studies literature as the literature you're using in the work that you're doing? And if those two things are all true, then I'm very happy for you to identify as a fat studies scholar. But if they don't, I'd rather you not. I'd rather you pick a different label. And I say that, and I know that there'd be lots of people who are like, oh, no, we don't want to be exclusive and kind of kick people out of the tent and stuff. But I spent 6 months in Europe last year on sabbatical and was actually kind of horrified by some of the scholars that I ended up coming across who were putting themselves forward as fat studies scholars, but not doing either of the two things that I was just talking about. And they seemed to think that simply because they were studying fatness, that they were doing fat studies. And so I've spent a lot of time since then. And I actually am writing a piece on this exact thing, two different pieces, actually. One of them's for the Handbook of Critical Obesity Studies, and then one of them's for the International Handbook of Fat Studies that I'm editing. But I'm actually writing a piece about, how do we differentiate between them and why it's important to do so, because I do think that it matters.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I mean, from what you're saying in terms of critical obesity studies camp and the weight studies or the weight science camp, I feel like that is when I'm writing stuff about weight stigma, is what they call it, or weight bias or weight prejudice. It's all under the term weight. I think that's where a lot of the science that, I don't know, I guess like health professionals have access to, because I'm coming at it from a public health and dietetics lens. And so that's where I'm sort of looking for my research that I'm drawing upon. But like, there's this whole other side of things that it sounds like you're even framing it differently as like fat stigma instead of weight stigma. And I'm curious to hear the differences in sort of how you conceptualize stigma and its effects on people's well-being from a fat studies framework as opposed to a weight science or critical obesity studies framework.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're right. Like, I think that for the most part, most people, especially within health fields, are probably more familiar, but also more comfortable with weight science rather than fat studies. And that makes sense from my perspective, because fat studies is it's a radical field of scholarship. And, from a fat studies perspective, there's not room to be had around whether or not we position fatness as problematic. And for a lot of people, especially in health fields, like if you're not willing to even kind of engage in that consideration, then it's not useful for them. So I think that, in me kind of differentiating and saying between like obesity scholars, critical obesity scholars, and weight scholars and fat studies scholars, I'm not necessarily kind of saying that one is like quote unquote better than the other, although obviously my personal bias as a fat studies scholar is I think what we do is awesome. But I do think that there's a lot of work being done by a lot of both people in the critical obesity field and also the weight studies field that's incredibly valuable contributions to science. From my perspective, I call it fat stigma because what I study, what I'm interested in eradicating, and what I see as something that is a very real barrier to the full participation for fat people, and what provides institutional oppression and discrimination to them, is stigma tied to their fatness. For me, the term weight stigma is kind of like a all lives matter kind of version of that, because it implies that, there are stigmas that might, because it's broader than just the stigma that might be attached to fatness. Now, I'm not suggesting that there aren't stigmas that aren't attached to other size groups, but that's not what I'm interested in studying or eradicating. I'm here for the fattest of the fat. So what my work, both as a scholar and an activist, is about addressing the stigma around fatness, not the stigma that might exist around weight.
I think that's really powerful because also I've seen, I mean, for the most part, I think in the literature on weight stigma, it is talking about fatness, give or take for the most part.
Almost entirely. Yeah.
Right. But then I've seen occasionally things pop up like, and people in quote unquote underweight bodies may also experience weight stigma. And so suddenly it's taking this term that I thought we sort of had all agreed upon that we're talking about fatness here. And then it's like, oh, and also people in smaller bodies are experiencing it too. And so it feels like a little bit of a, like a little bit of an all lives matter thing, I guess, where it's like we're lumping people in that have wildly different experiences of moving around the world and calling it the same thing. And it's really not.
Yeah. And I wonder how much of it actually is, because you're right. I read a lot of weight stigma science because almost all of that is actually what they're studying is fat stigma, but they're calling it weight stigma. And I have to wonder how much of that is just simply their unwillingness to use the word fat rather than weight. And, whether that's an unwillingness because, for them, fat is still a negative thing, or an unwillingness because they think for them, like fat seems more subjective, whereas weight is objective and science. And, whereas fat is political and personal. And, so I always kind of wonder, how much of, the way that term has been used and whatnot. I think that for the most part, most weight science scholars that I engage with, they're not incredibly bothered by the fact that I make a distinction between fat stigma and weight stigma. I've published in special issues of journals on weight stigma, my article that's all about fat stigma. So, it's good that there's some, conversations that are happening across the aisle. But yeah, for me personally, what I'm interested in eradicating is fat stigma. And so that's where my focus is on.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I'm curious to hear more about what you describe as the fattest of the fat or super fat, the experience of being super fat, which both you identify as, and also it sounds like your scholarship sort of centers on issues around, super fatness and navigating the world and navigating like public space, and also the, experience of stigma and discrimination that happens for people in super fat bodies. So yeah, I'm just curious to hear both personally and professionally or scholarly what you want to say about that, I guess.
I think from my perspective, it's a very simple kind of like we're not free until we're all free. And within fat politics and fat activism, the most marginalized are often the people in super fat bodies, and especially people in super fat bodies who have issues around their health, around their ability, those types of things. Like the people that often seem to kind of get thrown under the bus in a lot of even fat-friendly spaces. The people that quite often when I do media things I often kind of towards the end, the flustered person who's upset and frustrated that they haven't gotten me to capitulate to something, they'll go, they'll be like, well, what about the pound person who has to be lifted out of their house with a crane? And so that's the person that I'm always trying to keep at the fore of my mind when I'm doing my work and when I'm doing my scholarship, because that's the person that I'm here for, that I'm trying to work for. And I think that as a culture, we are so fast to, what's the right word? Like call forth this trope of that bedridden fat person as an illustration, when we're trying to kind of make a point, in the same way that, other things that we might call like the Nazi card, the who will think of the children card, the fat bedridden person card. Like there's, we're so comfortable as a culture, like pulling that out when it's useful for us as an illustration. But like independent of that, we completely ignore and discount the experiences of people in super fat bodies, even often within spaces of fat politics and fat studies scholarship. So we don't pay a lot of attention to the kinds of, so we might have a conversation around, fat people's accessibility to things like fashion or, wanting to ensure that physical transportation is accessible to them and these types of things. But quite rarely are we really talking about kind of what it means for those bodies whose bodies start after even the plus size fashion line labels end. So, who aren't able to go into any store that is a brick and mortar store to actually find clothing, or their needs around what it means to have a physically accessible environment, whether that's public transportation, the size of stalls and restrooms, all sorts of things like that we don't really talk about. And I don't know why. I often think about why we don't talk about that more, even within the fat community. And I wonder how much of it actually is our own still internalized like healthism. This idea of kind of being able to think about, well, I'm fat, but I'm not like, that fat. Or the kind of ideas of, well, maybe at that, people who are that fat might have more health problems. And so is it useful to, like, if we include them in our stuff, then that's actually going to hurt our larger arguments that we're trying to make that are healthist arguments anyway, that, you can be fat and healthy and, whatever.
And I'm a healthcare provider and I use the health at every size paradigm. And when I talk about health at every size, inevitably someone's like, well, it can't be health at that size. What about the bedridden person? What about, the X pound person, whatever the most pounds someone can weigh in their head? It's like, what about that person? They can't be healthy. And I think that is such a hard barrier for people to get across because and I think from what I've heard from super fat folks as well say is like the pressure to lose weight. I mean, Roxane Gay was sort of a very public example of this. The pressure to lose weight is greater as you go up the size spectrum, and is probably the greatest on the super fattest among us. And so to experience that constant pressure and to have such internalized fat stigma because of all the shit that you have to go through in life, it's hard to get away from diet culture. It's hard to say no to weight loss. It's easy to succumb in some ways to those healthist arguments because, if you're feeling uncomfortable in your body because of all the stuff you have to face, and also because spaces aren't designed for you to give you access or to give you maybe the mobility that you need, like to have mobility aids, having a lot of internalized stigma about that, about meeting those needs for yourself. It makes more sense to people, even sometimes people who are in that marginalized identity, to try to lose weight, to try to capitulate to what diet culture wants, rather than to say, no, fuck that. This world may not be designed for me, but I deserve to be accommodated.
Yeah. And I think that, obviously fat people, including super fat people, they're not a monolith. We're all individuals with our own kind of intersections of oppression. And, especially like I walk through the world with white privilege, which protects me from so many things because white supremacy is alive and well everywhere. And so my experiences as a super fat white person or super fat white woman even are significantly different from what, super fat women of color might experience. I'm currently able-bodied. I'm incredibly well-educated. I have a lot of different forms of privilege that definitely mean that the way I experience my super fat body in the world are very different from how a lot of other super fat people experience the world. And that's part of why I try to keep that idea kind of in my mind always, is I've got the abilities to, keep pushing, keep working, keep yelling. It doesn't cost me in the same way the social capital and other things that it might for others. And so, if I can put my super fatness on the line, then I'm willing to do that for as long as I can in that kind of way. I think that, for me, I actually spent a lot of time when I first really got interested in the scholarship around this area and the activism. I spent a lot of time talking about health. I kind of thought that was like the path to freedom for fat people, was if I could just get people like my dad, for example, to understand the real science that we have around what the relationship between weight and health is, and how pretty much what most people think that they know is not supported by evidence. And I mean, I spent years working to educate people around that, because I thought that was the path to freedom for fat people. I really did. I thought if we can just get people to appreciate that being fat doesn't mean being unhealthy, then that's how we make progress. And it took me a few years to actually realize that it isn't the path to freedom, that actually it's simply a form of respectability politics, and that actually it does more harm than it does good because of who it does leave behind, or because of who it does throw under the bus. Because if there's ever one fat person anywhere who isn't 100% healthy, by however we want to define that, then if I'm trying to make arguments around the dignity of fat people, the civil rights of fat people, the freedom of fat people that are in any way tied to health, then there's always going to be, other examples people can point to undermine that, to underwrite that. And so a few years ago, I stopped. I don't talk about the health stuff anymore in that way. And, it frustrates journalists quite often because they really want me to talk about that. And it often frustrates other scholars. And like, I can appreciate that and stuff. But for me, it's like the fat herring. It actually doesn't do us any good. It actually hurts us kind of overall as a group. And it hurts other groups as well, to buy into the idea that someone's humanity or someone's civil rights should in any way be tied to their health status. Yeah, so it's an interesting part of my own journey. And now, in a way, like I've swung back around to it because I now speak largely around issues of health, but I speak around it as the fact that fat stigma is a social determinant of health. And so I talk about the ways that that negatively impacts on the health and well-being of fat people.
Yeah, and I think that is a really useful framework because there is no reason we should have to debate people's worthiness using the language of health. That is total bullshit, and that's healthism, and that's not okay. But there are some realities to people being stigmatized for their fatness, for their weight, that being definitely like having a negative impact on both mental and physical health and overall well-being. So being able to speak about that, I think, is kind of I don't know, I've been thinking about it lately as sort of like the secret door into, getting people on board. Like it's the way to like bridge that divide with people who, especially with people who are care about people's well-being, like health professionals, for example. I talk to audiences of health professionals a fair amount, and I think people go into the helping professions or the health profession because they think that they're doing good. They think that they're helping people by doing what they think is helping their health, and to be able to show like, no, actually what you've been taught about weight and diets and body size and all of that is not helping, is actually harming people. And here are some examples. Here's the evidence of that. I think that is a really helpful way to frame it because it can actually sway some people.
Yeah. And I think there's work to be done, and I'm partly interested in doing it around demonstrating empirically through epidemiological means the relationship between fat stigma and the health of fat people. We have decades of evidence that's been built that demonstrates that racism is bad for the health and well-being of people of color, especially Black people. And so it will be interesting to watch moving forward who has the opportunity to collect similar data to see if sizeism, to see if fat stigma has the same, negative impacts. Because at the moment, there's been some of us, and I've published around this about what if all of the variants that we can identify, because there is some around health outcomes related to weight and to size. What if all of that or most of that is best explained because of fat stigma? That would potentially blow open an entire paradigm of how people think and approach these things. Now, that doesn't actually mean that it's going to change it, because we have the science to know that racism, is incredibly bad for people of color. That hasn't, actually done much to address the institutional oppression that they experience and the everyday racism and microaggressions. And of course, none of that will ever touch white supremacy because that's just part of the woven fabric of our lives. But as a scientist, I get excited about the idea of building these repositories of evidence that we can use to continue to expand our understanding and knowledge in that field.
Absolutely. I get excited about it too as a journalist and anti-diet dietitian. It's like I want more people who are in fields where they're doing harm to know this evidence and understand this evidence and maybe do less harm. I think that could be amazing. It could really change the way that people experience healthcare, at least in our society. But of course, diet culture is such a huge institution at this point and is so built on the foundation of white supremacy and so woven into our society that I think it's going to be a long road to try to undo it. But I'm taking my place at the wall with my little pickaxe and trying to chip away at it the best I can.
Which is great. I mean, that's, all of us have a role to play. Every single one of us, need to be working towards fat liberation in order for us to get there. So
yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think you're doing amazing work and you're making such waves in the world. So I'm excited to see what emerges from your research too.
Well, I mean, I appreciate you saying that. I feel, like I'm just one of the many, people tossing pebbles in the water, trying to make some ripples. But I do have to say that I'm increasingly excited about the younger scholars I see coming up. So there's so many scholars at the postgraduate levels at the moment who are focused on fat studies scholarship, who want to be fat studies scholars. And that makes me really, really excited because that could have been me even 15 years ago, but it just wasn't a thing in the way that it's becoming now. And so I'm super excited and, always looking for ways and opportunities that I can help support the younger scholars moving forward in the field because it's so exciting to see. And they're so incredibly amazing and resilient because nowhere in the world can you get a qualification in fat studies. The neoliberal project has ensured that universities around the world, in fact, are closing down women's studies programs and queer studies programs and indigenous studies. They're closing those programs. They're not opening new ones. And they're sure as hell not opening new ones in fat studies. But it's just incredible to me, all of these younger scholars who are really making an effort to identify the right scholars at the right schools to work with, connecting with each other through online spaces and engaging in opportunities when they arise in order to continue building the field. It's just incredible to watch.
That's amazing. And yeah, I think the internet probably has really enabled that for people to even know it's a thing and then to seek out other people who are doing that thing. So that's really exciting. So can you tell us where people can learn more about your work and connect with you and, maybe if there's any of those scholars listening right now to potentially reach out and connect?
So I'm kind of all over the internet.
Yeah, you have many tentacles out there.
I do have an About Me page for people who are familiar with About Me. If you Google my name or you Google Friend of Marilyn, which is the name of my blog and my podcast and whatnot, you'll definitely find me. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, all around. And yeah, just searching for Friend of Marilyn should bring you to me or my name. I mean, one of the things that I am currently involved in at the moment that I'm really excited about for people who are interested in learning more about fat studies as a field is I'm hosting monthly, I'm calling them moos. So it's like a MOOC, but fatter. So basically what it is these are discrete events that happen every month that are for 2 hours at a time. And for each Fat Studies Moo, I have a different guest scholar who's presenting on a different topic. So there's been 3 so far, and we had a scholar talking just about fat studies as a field for the first one. But then we've also had one scholar talking about weight and the law. And then the last one was about fatness and neoliberalism. So these are basically kind of 2-hour sessions where the scholar usually presents a half-hour segment about the topic. And beforehand, they will have provided to the participants a few articles they want them to read or a podcast to listen to or something kind of like his homework. And after their presentation, it's an open group discussion, and people ask questions of the scholar and the scholar asks questions of the participants. And it's this really cool kind of 2-hour class on the topic itself.
Wow, that sounds amazing.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you just Google that, Fat Studies Moo, so that's MOOOO, you will definitely you can find a place on my blog that talks about what it is. And I advertise the upcoming ones each month across my social media platforms. So I'm really excited about that as a way of bringing people together and learning more. And I'm learning heaps, and it's been really great.
Oh, it sounds amazing. I want to go. I want to participate. I'll put a link to that in the show notes so people can find it easily for this episode. So,
very cool.
Check out the show notes for this page if you want to learn more about the moos. Yeah, so amazing. Cat, I could talk to you forever. We were talking earlier about how we couldn't fit all of it into an hour and 15, and we did not even get.
Sorry. So sorry.
No, this was amazing. So fascinating, and we'll have to have you back on again another time to talk more. But thank you so much for being here. It was a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you, Christy. I really enjoyed it.
So that's our show. Thanks again so much to Cat Pausé for joining us on this episode, and thanks to you for listening. If you're looking for some help getting started on your own anti-diet journey, grab my free audio guide, 7 Simple Strategies for Finding Peace and Freedom with Food. Head over to christyharrison.com/strategies to get it. That's christyharrison.com/strategies. To get full show notes from this episode, including all the resources we discussed, plus a full transcript, head over to christyharrison.com/170. That's christyharrison.com/170. And to get the transcript, just scroll down to the bottom of the page and enter your email address. If you've gotten something out of this podcast, please help us reach more people who need to hear the anti-diet message by sharing this episode with your friends and family on Apple Podcasts or iTunes or whatever your favorite podcasting platform may be. And be sure you're subscribed yourself at whatever platform you use to listen to podcasts. Just go to christyharrison.com/subscribe. It's christyharrison.com/subscribe. A big thanks to our editor and engineer, Mike Lalonde, and to my Food Psych programs team, including our community and content associate, Vinci Chue, our administrative assistant, Julianne Watasik, and our transcript assistant, Megan Saichi, for helping me out with all the moving parts that go into producing this show every week. Our album art was photographed by Abby Moore Photography and designed by Meredith Noble, and the music you're hearing behind me now is by a band called AWOL, and the track is called Food, used under the Creative Commons license. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay psyched.
Stupid or scared, no work in the kitchen now.